And joining us this week is Karl Moore, an associate professor at the Desautels Faculty of Management, one of the top international schools of business at McGill University in Montreal. Good to see you again. Welcome.
Always good to be here, Tom.
We always enjoy having you stop by to talk about some of the great trips that you and your students at McGill have taken over the years, getting your students out of the classroom into the real world where they learn about emerging markets and economies around the world. You headed to Egypt and Morocco this year on the trip.
Yeah, 11 days in early March, and the slogan of the trip was taking the future to the future, young people to where there's strong economic growth, and it was year 13, and so we had a wonderful time, about 48 of us, students and alumni, and we have students from across the university, not just business, because it brings a broader view of the world. One of the women was studying art, history, and so could talk about Moroccan art and things like that. So it gives you a bigger view of the world. So had a wonderful time. Mainly business meetings with government and with chief executives and entrepreneurs, but also spent the last day in a surf town, if you would. They had camel riding, horseback riding as well. There was four-wheel vehicles if you wanted to do that. And it's a new cluster the government of Morocco has created where they've had top-end hotels move there so that people from around the world will fly into this part of Morocco and stay at the resorts with their families, where in the past, before these hotels were there, it was not as attractive to families from other parts of the world.
Both Egypt and Morocco, a lot of foreign investment, especially from China.
So Africa has lots of minerals and other things which China increasingly is going after, where the West, the US and Canada and Europe, have somewhat neglected our place there, where we have some natural connections through language and from Africans moving to the US and Europe and so on, where there's a natural sense of connection. But China seems to have caught a bit of a march on us, and it's something where the West needs to catch up to influence Africa, perhaps self-servingly, but in the way of democracy and freedom and liberty, some of the things in our better moments we stand for.
And in Morocco, they have, 70% of the world's phosphate, which China is interested in to build batteries for electric vehicles.
Yeah, and we need it for batteries, but we also need it for fertilizer and farming. So it's something where the world really has a lot of a need for Africa these days.
What do your students get out of these trips?
Well, they get exposure often to countries they've not been to, and they're meeting people like cabinet ministers and CEOs of big companies that they probably wouldn't meet for years to come, if ever. So I get to meet them because I'm with 48 students and alumni from a top university in the world, where if you go back there, if you're the governor, you get to meet them for sure, and if you're CEO of an IBM or a Google, you get to meet them, but most of us don't get to sit down and meet at 19, 20 years old a cabinet minister and ask them a question. And we're not going as tourists, we're going as travelers, that we want to learn and understand and get insight from them.
So looking ahead now to 2025, are you already lining up where you're planning to go next year?
Maybe East Africa. We've been to 10 years ago South Africa, last year West Africa, this year North Africa, so it seems like, okay, get East Africa and you've done the 4 quadrants of it. So we're looking at maybe Kenya, possibly a day or 2 in Dubai on the way back because we're flying through Dubai. So we're looking at possibly East Africa. Another is maybe Greenland and Iceland. Greenland is the most indigenous percentage of the population in the world, and other than our friends in the US, it's our closest neighbor, but you don't go there because it's the Arctic Ocean, it's. So I love it, and I've been to Iceland 12 times teaching at Reykjavik University. Love to go to Greenland, but it's a matter, can we afford it? So the cost of the flights are the big thing, and it may point at this point to Kenya and possibly Dubai for a day or 2 on the way back.
Many of our viewers know that you, in addition to teaching at the business school, you're a columnist for the Globe and Mail, and for a number of years, you've hosted the CEO series on CJAD Radio in Montreal, and now other stations across Canada. It's syndicated. You interview top business and political leaders, movers and shakers from across Canada and around the world. Who have been some of your interesting guests in recent months?
Well, one was a guy named Stephen Jarlowski, who's 98 and worth almost $2 billion. So he moved many years ago to work for Alcan in Montreal after degrees at Cornell and Engineering, University of Chicago, then Harvard MBA, ended up working at Alcan. He had lived in France for a while, spoke French, and stayed in Montreal, which we're delighted by, and was a great investor. Going from, a few tens of thousands of dollars to almost 2 billion. I also interviewed the CEO of the Montreal club, the football club, the soccer club here in the States. 20,000 people go to the stadium. He actually played as a young man for the team, but the team loves that he was on that field playing 20 years ago, so he really understands what they're doing.
You've also written a number of books. One of the latest on the topic you've touched on before. They often talked about generational divide between boomers and millennials and Gen Zers.
Well, the basic thought, Tom, is that as boomers, we were taught a modern worldview. People under 35 have been taught a postmodern worldview. And so I explain what is modern, what's postmodern. And you and I are postmodern, are thinking to a considerable degree because we've been around the whole time. So younger people just don't get older people who tend to run the world still. They just don't understand worldview. Now, we somewhat understand a worldview. When I talk to executives, they agree that they have a postmodern worldview to a considerable degree, but younger people just have it on steroids, if you would. And it's that trying to understand them that's important. And I call them Generation Y. It's funny, I was at the Saint-Saison local supermarket, and I was talking with one of the cashiers there who's a student at Dawson College. And there was an older woman with me as well, behind me just waiting, and I was talking about the book, and she said, why do you call it Generation Y? And I said, exactly. And the woman and I laughed because that's her generation to say why. And to a large degree, it's a good thing. They're trying to understand why we're doing something, partly to say, but that doesn't make sense anymore. We should change our approach because it's outdated. I tell people that 30% of the time I'm reverse mentored by undergraduates. Some of them are teenagers. And when I say that to my undergrads, they nod with considerable happiness. Then I go, but 70% of the time, I'm mentoring you, don't forget it. So there's a room for a two-way street. So the challenge of older people is not to become yesterday's person, but to be today's person, where young people are just today's person. They just don't remember the past.
Generation Y, How Boomers Can Lead and Learn from Millennials and Gen Z. That's the book that's out. Now you're working on your next book as well.
Yeah, I'm doing it with a former student who traveled with me to West Africa last year, is going to law school, but took a year off to travel, and is a producer of my radio show. It's on introverts, ambiverts, and extroverts as leaders, based on hundreds of CEO interviews and C-suite executives. That's arguing that regardless of your hard wiring, you need to act as an executive as an introvert at times and listen. Can you just be quiet? And other times be a bit more of an extrovert and work the crowd in an appropriate way. So that a senior leader's got to be an ambivert, which is someone can act both ways. But a central point is that it's somewhat DNA. We're kind of hardwired that way. So it's saying it's the hardwiring that we are what we are, but we learn to act a certain way in some contexts.
Do you have a release date yet?
Hopefully the end of the year, early next year.
All right, and you're already working on another one?
Well, the one after that, it's a sports metaphor with a friend of mine who's at Darden School here in the States. He's a sports nut, and we've written some articles for the Globe and my Forbes blog about sports. And the analogy is you go from college ball to the NBA, the game speeds up. You're going, I'm playing with Shaq O'Neal or whatever, you can't believe it as a young person. And suddenly you're playing in the big leagues, so you got to slow the game down. So I interviewed Ken Dryden, the famous goalie, went to McGill, about that, and then Kim St. Pierre, who has 3 gold medals, is the goalie for the Canadian women's hockey team for years. And the book is really about when you go from star salesperson to sales manager, it's a different game. And when you go to vice president of sales, it's a different game than being a sales manager. Same with COO and CEO. So we're interviewing 50 people at each level, and McGill's providing me some students to help me with these interviews, about how do you slow the game down at that level, who've done it recently, the last couple of years, so it's today's world, not in the past, and try to understand that analogy. So the book is really about how do you slow the game down as you're promoted to the next level of whatever you do in a corporation or in the government.
Karl Moore, thank you very much for taking the time to be with us.
Always a pleasure, Tom.